This is a chapter on state legislatures. Question one, what are the functions of the legislature? Well, basically they have the following functions. Number one, of course, is to make the law. That's pretty obvious. The legislature is primarily designed to do that. What else do? They control the budget and finances. Essentially, the governor proposes a budget, but it's up to the legislature to pass one. And so the primary power for control over the budget, actually control over all finances, is left up to the legislature. Control over the executive branch means to supervise the executive branch, not, it's probably not a good word, I probably should have used something else, because control is in the hands to some degree of the governor, at least for about half the bureaucracy, and then the other half of the bureaucracy is controlled by the legislature. And in essence, it has a supervisory role over the governor and actually all the people who work in the executive branch. So in a sense, they're like there to see to it that they're doing their job, and if they don't, or there's some kind of scandal or something, it's up to the legislature to investigate that and take appropriate action. Control over the bureaucracy, it's the same thing. There are executive heads of the bureaucracy, but ultimate control or supervisory control is probably a better word, is in the hands of the legislature, and they do that by investigation, by calling hearings, and sometimes making it public, sometimes making it private, but always in an attempt to understand what the bureaucracy is doing, and it's their job to make sure that they're living up to the standards set by the laws and policies of the state. And then the last thing is the judicial function, and what that is power of impeachment. And in general, the legislature has power of impeachment over any executives, any members of their own branch, and the judiciary as well. So it's a pretty powerful branch of government. As a matter of fact, it still lives up to the intentions of the framers of constitutions back in the early days, that the legislature would be the predominant branch or the most powerful branch of government. The second thing is, why is the legislature more powerful than the executive? And the reason we ask that question is because it's not the case at the national level, where the president is way more powerful than Congress. How did that happen, or what's the circumstances at the state level that require or have the legislature more powerful than the governor? The first thing is that the legislature is more trusted by the people who put the Constitution together. Now, that may have been the case back in the beginning of the United States for the national government, but it still exists when state constitutions are rewritten in modern times, back in the 80s or 90s, or whenever the Constitution, a new Constitution is formulated. They tend to keep the power of the legislature as predominant. The second thing is they're given formal powers to make the law and to spend the money. Those are two of the most powerful things you could do in designating through a constitution of the powers of each branch of government. To give somebody power over making the law and giving somebody power over spending the money is in essence to give them the most power in the system. And that's what's happened. The state legislature has those two powers. The governor does not have anything like that. You see, what makes the president so powerful at the national level is that the president is able to make policy by taking action, especially in foreign policy. The president starts wars, and then the Congress has little they can do about it other than to just rubber stamp the action that the president took. But at the state level, there isn't anything like that. The legislature has the primary power. The governor is limited. Is no foreign policy to speak of. So the end result is it's the legislature making the law and spending the money, or responsible for spending the money. Although, keep in mind, as we'll talk about the governor in the next chapter, that he has the ability to propose things, and that's pretty important, but we'll see that later. Control over the executive appointments. They have to confirm appointments. Not all the appointments, but quite a few at the state level, just like at the national level. So-called cabinet members are approved by the legislature. Control over the bureaucracy, I mentioned that one before, that gives them power because the bureaucracy is fundamentally responsible to the legislature, not to the executive, even though the executive has control over some of the offices by appointing the leader or executive head. But the governor has only control of about half of them, including things like corrections and things like that. But we'll talk about that in the next chapter. So fundamental control over the bureaucracy belongs to the legislature, not the executive, as it is at the national level. And then impeachment, which you mentioned already, that the legislature can impeach or threaten impeachment, and that would be any person in the government, whether that's in the executive or legislature or in the courts. Third one is whether the problems facing the legislature. And the most important problem, of course, is money. There's a budget gap or revenue shortfall in most states. And that's largely been due to the fact that the national government doesn't supply the kind of money that it used to state and local governments back in, say, the 60s or 70s or 80s even. It kind of probably started mostly in the 80s, where there was a move to limit the amount of money the national government was giving to states. And the reason there's such a shortfall, because, first of all, the states kind of relied, in modern times, they relied on the national government for a huge portion of their budget money, and they don't have that anymore. And the other thing is, it isn't that the national government is just really much better at handling money. It's that they have a better form of taxation. The income tax, and we'll talk about that when we get to the chapter on taxes, is a much better system for raising money than is the state system, which is sales tax, and the local system, which is the property tax. So in essence, there's, especially these days, because the government faces the same kind of problems that the private sector does. For example, that the medical cost for employees is so high and is bankrupting everybody. It's amazing that we don't do anything about it, but that helps to create a gap. If you're going to have bureaucracy, if you're going to have permanent employees, whether that's in education or highways or whatever it is, you have to supply people with the same things you would supply them in the private sector, which would be a competitive salary, benefits like medical benefits, and thirdly, retirement funds. And all of those things are very, very expensive. And as a result, what happens is that the government faces deficits all the time. And it doesn't matter what state you're talking about, they're all in some kind of major trouble. You can see that with Illinois, because that's been a problem in the news between the governor and the legislature trying to come to some agreement. They spent years doing this. It's incredible. It's the same problem we face in New Mexico. The state legislature doesn't have much money. We're a very poor state. And so revenue shortfalls, it's a big problem. Infrastructure is another problem. Infrastructure is oftentimes old, whether that's bridges or highways or what have you. Um, Infrastructure could be also like mechanisms for getting electricity to people. A lot of that stuff gets old. For example, in Illinois, you have nuclear power plants, and those nuclear power plants are really good for somewhere between 25 and 50 years at the most. And then they're, have to be replaced. That stuff's very, very expensive, or the infrastructure there is going to be, you know, difficult, difficult to replace and because of the expense. Another problem, of course, is education. Education is becoming more and more costly all the time, where the state pushes it onto the individual who goes to school whenever they can, but it's still expensive because in large part states are required to give everybody an education from kindergarten um, through high school and provide that for free. So that's kind of the usual statement in a state constitution about education, that the state is required to do that. And that's expensive. It's also expensive to run colleges and universities. Those things are, by the state, are pretty expensive as well. It used to be back in the day when I went to college that it was really cheap, and nowadays it's terrible. It's really the expense, the cost of education has gone up. I'm speaking of college education, it's gone up, and like everything else. But it's Jackie and I the other day were talking about buying clothes in a catalog, how you could buy a shirt, um, for $25, and then it went up to $50, and now it's not uncommon to see a catalog price for $100 for the same thing, that you paid $25 for uh, a few years ago. Anyway, education, major problem because the cost of it is going up at all levels, not just college as I spoke of, but all levels. It's going up because you have to pay more for teachers and equipment, and back in the day when I was in college, I mean when I was in grade school or high school, all the teacher had was a board with some chalk. And nowadays you got to buy computers, and not only are you buying computers for classroom, but you're buying individual students uh, some sort of a laptop or something. So it's all very, very expensive, and education's going up. The expense of education is going up all the time. Another problem that they face is how to raise revenue without raising taxes. Boy, that's a cute one. How do you raise revenue without raising taxes? And they think of what I would call gimmicks, is what they do to try to improve the revenue sources for the state. Such things as gambling, lotteries, and casinos, and off-track betting, and all that kind of thing. Um, so that's kind of what the dilemma they're in, because if the legislature decides that they want to raise taxes, they're probably going to get in trouble. They probably won't get reelected. So they try to think of these other things. Another thing that they do, and we'll talk about it again later in more detail, but another thing they do is start charging you for things that they used to be free. Like, for example, it used to be free to go to museums. That was always just paid for as long as you could identify, show them some kind of driver's license or something that proved that you lived here in the state, then you got in for free. And now it's like $20 a pop just to go to some kind of exhibit or museum or something. And it's the same story here. We had a friend come and visit over the holidays, and we did some of that museum hopping. And yeah, it's expensive. So that's what they do. They try to figure out ways to raise money without raising taxes. Um, or they'll raise the sales tax, which in essence people don't pay as much attention to. Um, and of course, the last problem is how to face or how to cope with less federal money. Like I said, the money isn't there. The national government isn't going to bail them out. So the end result is they just have to figure out how to cut services and get by on the cheap as much as possible. Last question is professionalism. What is it, and how does it operate much at the state level? Basically, professionalism involves three things. It involves salary, paying competitive salaries, that is, getting people to serve in the government who are making equivalent money that you would make in, say, middle management or higher in a private sector. Second thing would be staff, supplying state legislature and the governor with enough people to enable them to do their job. And then time in session. Is it a part-time legislature or is it a full-time legislature? And if it's high salary, reasonable number of people in staff, and full-time sessions, not part-time, then that's considered to be professional. And what you're going to find when you look at like states, not surprisingly, the big states like California, New York, and so on, including Illinois, will be much more professional, full-time sessions, salaries. I should have added to full-time people. That is, people are career politicians as opposed to just amateurs. And then the smaller places like here, New Mexico, you have the opposite of, say, a place like Illinois, where you have part-time sessions and amateurs rather than professionals, limited staff, and low salaries in terms of what people are paid.